So I just finished painting my latest sculpt, and it occurred to me that I took a very different approach to this one. But then on reflection, quite a lot of the miniatures I painted over the last year have had different approaches. My approach with my early sculpts was to prime them in, it wasn't white, it was, I can't remember exactly what colour, it was a kind of beige, almost like a greeny bluey beige. And at the time I very much was in the mindset of using contrast paints and then just doing a little bit of extra work on top. So shortly after I finished these set of miniatures, I got rid of all of my Citadel paints, apart from the contrast paints. But generally speaking, Citadel just kind of annoys me. Look, I'm not saying Citadel paints are bad, because they're not. Of course they're not. Generally speaking, when it comes to the paints you choose, there's so many factors. And what occurred to me after collecting Citadel paints for many years, I think I had like 200 quid's worth of paints, and I still didn't feel like I had a good enough range of colours to achieve what I wanted to achieve. After a lot of research, I ended up going with Vallejo Game Colour, the newer version. I like seeing them laid out like this because it pleases my brain. I have to think less. But I don't stick to this when it comes to actually painting. This is just a good starting point for me. But for me, Citadel paints, or at least the ones I had, I felt like I had like 5 different reds and none of them worked together in any way. Also, I'm just sick of pots. I like dropper bottles. I'm bored of having to put a brush into a pot to get paint out. I don't want to do that anymore. I mean, to be fair, I still have to do that with contrast paints, but I just think some of them are actually quite excellent, so I do want to keep those. Another reason why I picked the Game Colour range is because they are actually quite matte. So here's an example of a miniature I painted purely with the Vallejo. I don't think there's any washes involved here because I'm also not a massive fan of washes. It's a very simple approach. I took darker browns to lighter browns up on top, and then I dry brushed a gradient going up. Very, very simple. There's bits of green for like the vines and stuff on there you can see, but the wood itself is pretty basic. It's brown. Brown from a darker tone to a lighter tone. This Wolpertinger, I painted again with the Vallejo colours. What I did do is reintroduce washes back into my workflow. And like I said, I really don't like using washes generally, but I decided once I did the colours on the wings, they were a bit too vibrant, and I wanted to tie them back into the browns of the bunny body, basically. I went for I guess they ended up being like a parrot wings. I just didn't want to paint brown. I think that was my thought process. So I ended up mixing Agrax Earthshade with some super matte medium, and that just filled the gaps in a little bit on the wings. It added a little bit of that dull brown colour into them, and I just feel like it very subtly ties it into the brown of the body a little bit more. It still looks weird because obviously this isn't a real creature. A golden pheasant, I think, is what I was trying to recreate, but whatever. The other thing I did with this miniature is purposely primed it in the main colour. It was brown to begin with. When it comes to priming, it both matters and doesn't matter, essentially. But for this, I was trying to just be efficient, I guess. So the other month, I made these little Hooble Gooble guys that, yes, I've still not finished. For these, I did a zenithal prime, which I don't really do very often. And then I purely used contrast paints. Basically, I wasn't totally sure how I was going to colour these guys, so I just wanted to kind of recreate the way I painted this guy, because I actually forgot the recipe. And because of the zenithal highlight, they're still very dull, but it was always my intention to paint over these. In a way, it was like an experiment. I just wanted to see how they came out with just contrast paints, to be honest. I think the other benefit of painting like this is you fill in the gaps roughly with the colour that you want to be in the gap. So when it comes to painting over, you don't have to be as accurate necessarily. Whereas if you were to be painting over a very bright primer, then you're going to have to work harder to make sure you fill those gaps in, especially if you're not going to use any washes, which you probably are. I feel like most people do, right? I'm just not a huge fan of using them. The point I'm trying to make, I think, is that you should experiment, because essentially it's what I've been doing without really thinking about it. It's just kind of happened organically. And you may not want to do that if you're painting a big army and you want consistency. Then yeah, changing up your style, it probably doesn't make sense. I get that. So I've shown this a few times. Here is my Garuda, still not painted, and it is almost a year old. This is primed in an army painter colour. I can't remember exactly what it is. I've even primed a load of goblins in this colour. Like I said, it both matters and it doesn't matter what you prime your miniatures in. But this is where happy accidents happen, because my latest miniature, this woodland troll, was primed in the exact same way. And this is an example of where the primer mattered, because it essentially guided me throughout the entire painting process. Now, when I actually sat down to paint this, I decided quite organically, it wasn't planned, that I was going to use the teal to actually dictate the shadow colours. I made sure that I kept the teal colours in the shadows, and the primer essentially guided me throughout doing that. Unlike the Tree Man dude, the wood here is actually made up of, you know, there is a brown base, but there's loads of blues and greens and yellows and purples. There's a lot of other colours going on there. His loincloth is where you can really see how I've utilised the blues, the teals for the shadows. Essentially, the cloth is three colours. There's this bone colour, there's a very, very light blue, and then a dark teal. Essentially, that base teal colour, it's basically present throughout the entire miniature, even in the face. And so this loincloth might look odd if that wasn't the case, but the teal essentially is bringing everything together. Now, if you were to analyse this up close, you'll see that there's a lot of chunky brush strokes. It's pretty rough in places. I've clearly allowed the primer colour to show proudly in some gaps where you could argue I was being lazy or clumsy and I didn't want to go into those gaps and paint anything else. And it's actually so freeing to not have to worry about being super neat and just getting into this, well, artist mindset. You know, at least for me, when I think about back at school, which is probably the last time I did any oil painting, and my approach to that and how messy I was. But I embraced that messiness. Sometimes I feel like we get hung up on being accurate with our brush strokes and we worry about mistakes and stuff, you know, whereas we should just be like Bob Ross sometimes and embrace those happy little accidents. I'm not telling you how to paint. You paint however you want to paint. I would just suggest that maybe you allow yourself to try different things, because you might be pleasantly surprised. But based on how I've painted this, I would say if you wanted a suggestion as to how to experiment with your next miniature, instead of priming it in a basic colour or a convenient colour, try priming it in a colour which will dictate its shadows. You could still do a zenithal highlight if you wanted, just to make life easier, depending on what colours you're trying to use, but just give it a go. Choose a primer colour that represents your shadows and let that guide the rest of your painting and just see what happens. I think I'm probably going to do the same thing with my GW trolls and goblins. And when you feel like you've finished with your painting experiment and there's just something not quite right about it and it just looks a bit odd, maybe just try basing it. I honestly think when you base something, it can really elevate the paint job. And that's also why I don't really like clear bases. I don't see the fun in that. I mean, you do you, if you like that, I just don't. I feel like at school, art felt a bit less subjective because, you know, essentially we had teachers marking us on our work. But I think it's important to remember that at school we were taught the rules, like perspective and colour theory. That's so that we could have an understanding of the rules, so then we could break them later on. But most importantly, this is supposed to be a hobby, it's supposed to be fun. So if the way you're painting is the fun way to do it for you, then it's the right way to do it. Being an artist isn't this secret club that you have to network to get involved in or train to be a part of. You are already an artist. So it's useful looking at tutorials and getting tips and guides from other people, that's fine. But ultimately, you need to paint the way you want to paint and the way that makes you feel happy. So I'd say embrace that inner artist, even if you don't think you are one, and allow that to guide you. And if the way you're painting your miniatures is the most enjoyable way to paint your miniatures, then that's the right way to paint your miniatures. Try new things, take risks, because you can always just paint over it. God, there's so many feathers. And then this guy is the other miniature I need to do. Again, feathers, more feathers.